Just introduce ourselves. My name is Bob Smith. I was hired at Atari in 1980 and did video pinball for them, and then left along with Rob Fulop and Dennis Coble to do a Magic. There I did Star Voyager and Dragonfire, Middle of the Sphinx, and Star Wars and Moonsweeper. I think that's all. And I've been doing games ever since, so there's a long list you're not interested in. But essentially, I'm a 26.
Yeah, I'm starting to worry. If you're going to require all of us to start naming them.
Yeah, I can get through my 2,600 titles, but
Okay.
apart from that, not much. Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, my name is Todd Fry. I started at Atari on August 9th, 1979. I did a couple of things, but probably definitely, I'm notable for the 2600 Pac-Man, which I wrote in 1981 and shipped in March of 1982. It sold millions of units and was a wildly successful product.
I'm Gary Kitchen. I started as an independent and did Space Jockey and the home version of Donkey Kong on 2600. Then I joined Dave and Activision in 1982, where I did Keystone Capers and Pressure Cooker on 2600.
David Crane. I worked at Atari with Nolan Bushnell from 1977 to 79, before spinning off and founding Activision. At Atari, first game I did, I think, was Outlaw, which was a midway arcade game. I just ripped it off completely.
This is being recorded, Dave.
I know. I think, as Todd mentioned, the statute of limitations must have run on something. And then my mother always wanted to be able to play slot machines, and so rather than let her go to Vegas and lose money, I did slot machine in the 2600, gave her one of those. Canyon Bomber and Depth Charge. And it seems like there was one after that. It really gets hard to remember them all at a certain point. But, and then off to Activision and all those games.
So why don't we, do you want to just talk a little bit about how you got into gaming? Maybe just each of us talk a little about how we get into gaming. And then we encourage you guys to reach out and ask questions, and that sends us down, paths where we may come up with humorous or interesting stories.
Yeah, what has worked in the past is one question leads to a story, and then the story leads to a question and another story, and pretty soon they say our time is up, so it's kind of what we're planning.
And we have to apologize in advance that you may have heard some of the stories. We strive every show to come up with new ones, but we'll see.
It's not easy.
You never know.
Oh boy, let's see. It's a long story. I came from a card playing family, so we didn't have any money, so we played a lot of board games, a lot of card games. So I was into cards. I became a boat builder. I built trimarans back in the early '70s, and then decided to move to New Mexico, build a dome, and do that life, and had kids. And finally, microprocessors came. Finally, Chuck peddled the 6502. So inexpensive machines started coming around, and in the meantime, I had taught myself to program. And I had a processor technology sold at the time, which was an old S100 bus 8080 machine, and did a racing game on it, and sold it, and said, hey, I like this. And about that time, my wife, who was born and raised in San Jose, said, oh, get me the hell out of New Mexico. So we went back to the Bay Area and went to work for Atari, and started doing 2600. So basically, on the strength of one game sold to a periodical, I got in. Dennis hired me. Actually, CoinOp made me an offer too, but I went with a consumer to do 2600. So I've always loved games, and I haven't looked back. I'm still doing games. I don't know better enough, I guess, but I'm still doing. It's now iPad, of course, but it always advances, doesn't it? Todd?
Yeah, so I'm a computer programmer. For me it's a calling that I came to in 1972. In the early 70s, every kid's a computer programmer now or something like that. But back then it was pretty rare, and you didn't have a lot of access to computers. But I just got the bug, and it changed me And I was at Berkeley High School, and we were right there at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley Labs. Larry Kaplan was at UC Berkeley at the time. My second year in high school, I got a job programming in a local federal computer center, and Larry was interning there. I had a good friend named Ian Shepard. This is how I got to Atari and gaming. But I am a computer programmer. I'm always 24/7. It's like, it's my heart and soul, basically, whether I like it or not. So I dropped out. I had that job programming. I met Larry. And I dropped out of high school and got a job as a carpenter. But several years later, I had a minor injury, so I went out to get a job in the computer industry. It made sense to me. And I talked to several places, but by then, Larry had gone to Activision. Larry had gone to Atari. And my friend Ian, who was a high school buddy, another lifelong computer programmer, had gotten a job at Atari. So Ian got me the interview at Atari, where Larry and he were, you know, high school buddies were working at Atari, basically. And I interviewed just fine, and they offered me a job, and I took it. And so I went to work, and I wrote software. And I'm really glad that the software that I was writing was, you know, it was just an accident, basically, that what they needed was games. I'm really glad, actually, that no one had offered me a job before that, right? Because if someone had offered me a job writing industrial control software, I would have, that's a dumb, I was a kid, right? I would have taken it because it was just a job. So, luck plays a big role in this. And like, the way I came to write Pac-Man was in May of '81, Dennis Coble was running our division, and I got a really crappy job review from him. And after a really crappy job review, because I had taken a long time writing 400, 800 asteroids, and it wasn't a great product, it was decent. He said, oh, and now that I've just told you that I don't think you should keep, you know, you should quit, but I'm not going to fire you. He said, and in the meantime, we have 2 games we need to start next week, and those are Defender and Pac-Man. And you and Bob are available to start projects, Bob Polaro. Because I don't care which of you does which, you guys decide. So I went to Bob, and I said, I really did not care for Pac-Man all that much. I liked the Prince Finder. I loved Defender. So I said to Bob, I don't care. You choose. And the next day Bob came to me and said, I don't think it's possible to do Pac-Man, so I'll take Defender. Smart guy.
And the rest is history.
It turns out it is totally possible to do a very credible Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, and I proceeded to do so. So, gotchas.
So, unlike everybody else on this panel, I was East Coast at the time I got into video games. And I was fortuitous to get a job at a little teeny tiny 4-person consulting firm doing engineering work, and I didn't know a damn thing about engineering, so I was the guy that went out and got lunch for everybody. And I eventually graduated up to soldering circuit boards and building things. And the company was doing electronics, so it was doing, you know, circuit boards and digital timers and clocks and things like that. And one day, Mattel came out with a little football game with the little red LED segments. And we saw that and said, hey, that's the same technology that we use in our timers. We should try to make toys. So I worked on a toy product for Parker Brothers called Wildfire. And somehow or other went from being the guy that bought lunch to being the guy that programmed it, because no one else in the building knew how to program. So I was the Marine that stood when everybody else stepped back, and I got the job of programming it. And then I invented Bang Shot, which was another toy for Parker Brothers. It was a billiards game, and I kind of got the bug to make games. I mean, I said, God, I'm never going to program databases. This is much more fun. Kind of like Todd said, it's just fortuitous. That's what we needed in the job, so that's what I did. Then I saw the demise of the electronic toys coming because of these guys on the West Coast stealing all the money making video games. So I went out and bought an Atari, and I had an Apple II. I had one of the first Apple IIs. which was once again a stroke of luck because I had a 6502 microprocessor in it. And I went out and bought an Atari and ripped it open and said, hey, this has a 6502 also. That's pretty lucky. So I used the Apple II as a tool to reverse engineer the Atari.
And your soldering skills.
And my soldering skills, absolutely. I figured out how to put an inverter on the board so that I could run around, EEPROMs. And I learned how to program the Atari and did a game called Space Jockey for my current company. And then I figured out, as a kid in his 20s, that I may be worth more than $11,000 a year. So I went to my boss and said, you know, maybe you should give me a raise. And he said, no, you're not worth it. So I left. And then I did Donkey Kong for Coleco and called Activision, main number on the West Coast, and asked for the head of product development. And got a guy named Tom Lopez and told him that I was on the East Coast writing 2,600 games. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, no, I am. I'm just finishing Coleco's Donkey Kong. And he said, where do you live? I'm coming out tomorrow. And then I ended up joining these guys and working at Activision. Been in games ever since.
I probably was more destined to do this than the accidental stories we're hearing, only because for some reason I was into games when I was a kid. If you had a board game that was written for 4 players and you only had 3 players, the neighborhood kids would just come to me and say, rewrite the rules to make it work for 3. And it's just something I did. I could figure out how to make it work and make it fun and not too challenging and that sort of thing. And then my mother was an art teacher. She taught watercolor painting, so of course all of her kids had to take her classes. And I would take these classes in watercolor painting, and I said, God, this is slow. I mean, you work hours and hours and hours on every little detail, and then you end up with 1. And I said, you know, there's got to be something I can work on and end up with millions of them, you know? Manufacture something, sell it, consumer product. I didn't care what it was. So I was very much into electronics. But as we learned later, the skill set that you needed for this kind of thing, it was very left brain, right brain. You had to be extremely technical to be able to do a 2600 game. But if you weren't artistic as well and able to relate to normal people instead of just being a closet nerd, you wouldn't be able to figure out how to make it fun for people. So it really all kind of built that way. So I studied digital electronics before there was digital electronics. I had a computer programming or computer merit badge in Boy Scouts in about 1970, where I got to use an IBM 360 computer and a card sorter machine, you know, and the old hollow wreath cards and all that kind of stuff. So everybody has computers today, but you know, there's really a half-generational split here. I mean, those of us that made the games are about 10 years older than most of the players, most people here who played them. So our experiences were that there weren't computers. I mean, you had to work for a bank to do database programming to even see a computer, to touch a computer. Even then, you didn't get to touch it. You delivered your cards to the computer operator and came back the next day for your printouts. You know, I mean, there weren't home computers, weren't personal computers, but still, the combination of the games, the art, the technology, kind of led me in that direction. And yet, I was actually very reluctant to do it. I was working at National Semiconductor, pretty much doing things that my boss didn't understand, so I could do anything I wanted because I was computerizing the whole department and building computers from scratch and all this sort of stuff. And so I could pretty much do anything I wanted. And that was let's go into the first story, since I'm the last one with the intro, is that was when I'm playing tennis with Al Miller. He and I were doubles partners, playing tournaments together. And one day, he comes to the court, we play tennis, and afterward we're sitting around, and he hands me the ad that he had just written. He was working at Atari, and he was writing an ad for the San Jose Mercury News to advertise for video game programmers. And he handed me this ad and said, proofread this, it goes out tomorrow. And I read it, and I said, not only is it well written, I think I'd like the job. So I went back into National Semiconductor where I was working, and on a computer that I had built, wrote a resume, interviewed at Atari at 10 a.m. the next morning, got a call at 2 p.m. that I'd been offered a job and gave notice to my boss that afternoon. So it was less than 24 hours from the time he hands me this ad that hadn't gone live yet to the fact that I'd accepted a job at Atari. And it was funny because in that era in Silicon Valley, the engineering companies were such that you couldn't, the only way to make a lot of money is to change jobs every 7 months or so. Because you couldn't get enough of a raise under any company's policy to make up for what someone would pay you if you crossed the street. So people were just going all over the place, changing jobs that fast. And what Al Miller told me at Atari is he said, figure out what you want to make. And tell Atari that what you're currently making is 12% less than that, because 12% is the maximum they will pay for someone to cross the street and need a job. So I chose my salary, lied on my application as to what I was making, and ended up starting at Atari for a whopping $18,000 a year.
I started at 16.5.
I started at 15K.
I already told you my salary. So anybody got any questions about how we got into it?
Yeah, but before we go on, the other thing I'd like to take advantage of is Rob Zanibel is sitting here in the office, or in the office. He's ex-Atari, 2600 guy. You should come up here,
Come
Rob.
up, have a seat. All right, Rob.
Probably the person who worked at Atari the longest.
Actually,
That's true.
I was there when they dissolved the company in 1995, was it? That was a lot of fun. I actually was university educated, came out of Cal, and I interviewed with Mike Alba and Owen Rubin. And they said, you have to work in assembly language. I said, great. He said, you have to work on the naked iron. I said, I love that shit. I'm an electrical engineer. Give me more. You know, I love that job. And I got to make games. Watch Howard's movie. If you want to hear all my good stories, go out and get Howard's movie, Once Upon a Atari. It's a great flick. If you care about crazy stories like this, you owe it to yourself to get the film, because it's got me, it's got everyone dishing the dirt. I just didn't want to make weapon systems. I was basically offered a lot of jobs by people to build missiles and surveillance systems and crap, or to make Wall Street people richer than they already were. And I didn't like it. And then Owen Rubin comes and says, you want to make video games? Yeah, okay. Because I always loved games. So it's a natural fit.
And Rob wrote one of my favorite games ever on the Lynx, the Atari Lynx, right? The multiplayer flying jet game, Warbirds, was it?
Okay, Warbirds, yeah.
What a great
Warbirds,
game.
yeah.
I was addicted to that game.
That was my best word for sure.
Yeah.
That was a hell of a game to sell, too. It was a hard game to get out there.
So, opening the floor. What do we got here? Anybody got any questions? Go ahead.
David, I wanted to ask about the Ghostbusters game, because I think it's one of the greatest licensed games ever made. And then, so like, how did you come up with that concept of that and develop it? And hypothetically, if you had been given the Back to the Future franchise, what do you think you might have made of that?
Wonderful. That's the answer.
Oh.
It's been sent in.
Yeah. What is it? Let me read it. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was you wanted to hear about Ghostbusters C64. Ghostbusters C64 is kind of an interesting concept, only because it's one of the first successful movie tie-in games. And I've explained it many times. It's always serendipity. There's always something good happens, something lucky happens, some great thing happens to make a great product happen. But the biggest problem with a movie tie-in game, in that era anyway, was movies were made, movies came out, movies were in the theater, and then we find out if they're successful. And if they're successful, somebody says, hey, let's make a video game about that movie. And by the time you make a video game about that movie, unless you take only 5 weeks to do it, by the time you've made a game, it's out in theaters and it's on the wane. It's no longer popular. Now, some turn into franchises like Ghostbusters with 2 and 3 and however many there were. But we recognized that at the time. And so they were just starting to send scripts to video game companies also, to try to give us a little head start. And if you could read the script and think you were a genius enough to figure out if it was going to be a big movie, then yes, you take the license, and yes, you dedicate some of your staff to do it. There's opportunity costs. If you're doing that, you're not doing some other game that might be an original game that turns out to be a big success. And we got the script very late in the process, though. I mean, the movie was in post-production, I'm sure. Maybe going to come out in a couple months in theaters. And we all read it and said, yeah, this could be really funny. I mean, Saturday Night Live cast, and they said actually in an interview once that they gave all the funny lines to Bill Murray, and they didn't make that mistake in the sequels. But he was certainly funny in that movie. So we thought, you know, it would be nice to be able to do this, but how do we go about doing it? And I sat there and looked at it and said, you know, there's only one way to do this, and that is to take the current game that I'm working on, which is more than half completed, and turn it into Ghostbusters. And I was working on a game called Car Wars for the C64. As an aside, I have a Parents' Choice Award for doing games with positive human values and all that kind of stuff, and that's because every time I started to shoot them up, I went off and did something else. It wasn't really intentional or whatever. I mean, I had this game where you're driving two cars and you're killing people, but it never made it to market.
And you did that other game where cars ran people over.
I did that one too, yes.
And turned it into a chicken in the last one.
Read some watch on the screen. So anyway, so I had this Car Wars game, and it was going to be, actually I was making the game because the title was so good. I mean, after Star Wars, we have to have a Car Wars game. It wasn't based on a board game, or I think Larry Niven did a novel also. And that I had read, but I wasn't going to necessarily tie it into the book. It was just a great name for a video game. And the idea was there'd be an in-game economy where as you did well in a level, you get points, dollars, whatever, and you buy new weapons and you outfit yourself for the next level and all that. And I had the customizing of the car, a little bit of the in-game economy, but didn't really play into this game. I had a top view of a car that would kind of be the chase scene, that you could have two cars chasing each other and shooting at each other. And a city street map, you know, and all these elements. And each one of those elements in a game can take a month or two to make sometimes. So having all those elements, all I really had to do was retask them into a game. And then the next question is, how do you make a game about a movie? And by the time somebody plays the game, they've already seen the movie. So you don't follow the movie plot really in any way. And what's fun about that? Turn it into an interactive movie of something somebody's already seen the result of. You know? So my philosophy became simply design an original game that takes place pretty much in the universe of the movie, and wherever possible with the characters, if they're neat characters like the Marshmallow Man, you know. And just try to design a game that relates to the movie. It uses the characters in the universe, as I say, and that's how the Ghostbusters concept came up. But it was limited by what my Car Wars code had in it already for me to get it done in any reasonable period of time. Now the best part of the Ghostbusters game came in the last week, and that's the title page.
Yeah, how did you do that? That was really good.
Well, I do this all the time when I'm doing a game and I say, you know, I'm out of time, I'm out of features, I'm out of room, I'm out of ROM, I'm out of memory, but there's this cool thing I just got to do. And so I had Hillary Mills, the artist who had done all the art, draw up the Ghostbusters logo, and it was Russell Lieblich made the music.
Yeah.
And we contracted a speech utility group that was working in Berkeley to give us a Commodore 64 digitized speech driver, and tried to put this whole thing together so that it would have the theme song played with the logo up, and that it could yell Ghostbusters. And got all that stuff in there, and I said, you know, what we really need to go with that is the lyrics in a traditional 1940s, 50s, follow the bouncing ball, sing-along thing. And I didn't have 7 minutes left to do it. So I called my good buddy Gary on the East Coast, and I said, "You aren't doing anything right now, right?" And he and his, I think the whole team chipped in for about 3 days. And
Right.
cranked that thing out.
Right, did the bouncing ball.
And it's one of the most memorable things. I've got quotes from the game magazines back there as, you know, quoting it as the most memorable moment in video game history to date. Yes, that title screen.
Sometimes you just see something and you know it belongs. I once even took a suggestion from a CEO. And it's true. When I was working on Warbirds, Sam Trammell walked into the office, and you know, I'm anxious to show it off and look good in front of the top boss. You know, so I'm showing the game, and I do a shoot down, and he sees the plane going. He says, "Well, it's going to whistle as it falls out of the sky, isn't it?" So I said, "Yeah, of course, Sam, sure." And, you know, it does. It's perfect. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it myself. But.
That may be the only suggestion in history from a CEO that uses it. Very possible. Yeah. All right.
Sam was actually an excellent CEO of ETW, one of the best people in the world.
Go ahead.
So early in, you know, in Atari 2600 days and things like that, especially in the arcade realm, they had all these kind of criteria to figure out whether a game was kind of supposed to be a hit or how they evaluated it. Like, you know, how many quarters per hour could you get out of an arcade game? And some of you probably know that pretty well. What ended up happening, and there was always fights with the hardware, like, can we throw a little extra RAM in these machines? And they're like, no, that breaks the amount of money per hour that they're going to make. What kind of, were there any criteria like that when, like, home
No.
games? That's what I thought.
Not one little bit.
How did you guys evaluate whether, like, okay, we shipped this 2600?
If it sold well.
Yeah, that was it.
About the Morse
Think
code
about
part,
this
but-
business model for a brief minute with
Yeah.
me. You're paying engineers me out of school. I'm demanding a top salary of $30K a year.
Yeah.
Okay, you're right. We'll double employees' cost to get their annual, you know, value, cost to the company, electricity and everything else. And take that fact that it takes us like 6 months to make a goddamn game. And you're looking at, what, 15 to 20K total production costs for a finished product? Hell, you're paying the execs. You know,
Yeah.
these games are basically free. And so Atari's basically publishing, that was the wonderful thing. Just like music in the 60s, the execs had no frickin' clue what was going on. They didn't know what was fun, they didn't know what was sell, they had no idea how we made this shit. So they basically just shut us off in our building and left us alone. It was the greatest thing for productivity you could ever do.
The only debate, like what you're talking about, was whether it was a 2K, 4K, or 8K ROM.
Right.
And that was a matter of, you know, what, 20 cents maybe? But when you put it over a couple of million cartridges, it's
Yeah.
serious money. And, you know, the one I'm always asked about is the Donkey Kong one. It was a 4K cart, it should have been an 8K cart. They wouldn't spend the extra 20 cents a unit. And, you know, it
Yeah.
ends up costing you quality in the game. And a smart company recognizes that, and a dumb company doesn't care.
Yeah, I didn't know if there was any criteria that
Well,
at some point somebody
no, I
was
mean,
just
still
a thief.
isn't.
The high-paid execs didn't play video games.
Yeah, no.
So they didn't have a concept of market research. So what market research was really was all of us hanging out in arcades. So, you know, we all had game ideas and then we'd rip off some arcade game or do an original, it didn't really matter. But yeah, the closest it ever came was actually the impetus for the spin-off from Atari to Activision, which is when the marketing department, at the time, that's post-product marketing, that's not, you know, right now marketing also has, you know, research and other things that happen pre-product, but at the time it was just post-product marketing, sent a memo out showing the sales of game cartridges for the previous year, just in order of sales, percentage of sales actually. And what they said in the memo is, these games are selling more than those games, do more like this.
As you notice, that technique has not changed. Huh? How many first-person shooters, right?
But in reality, at Atari, it was a very balkanized company. So product development, that's us, would make the best thing we could, which was, you know, if we make, a lot of people made what they thought was a fun game. Some of us just made what we were told by myself and Howard to a certain extent. And then sales projections and the size of the ROM buy occurred in a different building, on a different block, by different people who had no connection whatsoever with product development. We had no visibility on that. No one would come to ask them, they just bought a certain number of ROMs. Personally, I have no idea how they did it. I think maybe they bought a medium-sized number, and if it sold well, they ordered more. There were a lot of moving parts to it. Back then, to make a product, you had to build a ROM mask, and ROM masks weren't free, actually. You had long lead times. You had 6 or 8 month lead times at first. You'd finish a game, and then you'd send it to some semiconductor company. You'd send the tape. I mean, I'd give a tape to someone. It would disappear from me. But there were a lot of moving parts to it. And they were expensive. ROMs were not free. They were much more expensive than CD-ROMs. I think they were probably running at $5 or $10 actually for a boxed cartridge. There was a lot of moving parts.
Well, and one very important point coming out of all this is if you don't know, traditional business, this idea of the product development group being isolated and separate and actually having the freedom to make decisions on what we're doing is very strange in the real world of business. I mean, Nabisco doesn't have a product development department where some guy goes, hey, let's make this cookie with chocolate sandwich on either side and cream in the middle. This is all, in big companies, it's all driven by marketing, and it's all driven by research, and there is no freedom, and even in game companies, for the most part, there is no freedom anymore in, hey, I'm going to make a game about, guy making a hamburger on an assembly line. No, it's marketing, doing exactly what Dave said, of going back and looking at what sold in the last 12 months and say, making more of those. And it's unfortunately a ridiculous way to do business.
But just speak to these creativity meetings. They're incredible. What does the American public want? Well, what have they bought? Let's give them more. You guys don't have a chance at it.
But this speaks to Rob's point. It actually didn't cost our company that much to come up with a product. And then they could decide how much to invest in it afterwards. I mean, essentially to them, at what the numbers were, product development was fundamentally free. Right? They paid Rob $30,000 to make a game, which might then go on to sell $30 million worth. It was essentially free. So they could just decide later.
You're an anxious person.
Yeah.
How is the industry during the period between the bottom fell out and the rise of Nintendo?
It was dead.
It was brutal. It went from what we called the days of Rome with, togas, chariots, money falling from the sky, and suddenly reality set in that you actually had to try to make a profit.
In '82, Atari netted $600 million. In '83, Atari lost $600 million.
Yep.
So related, you had mentioned the list of the cartridges and the sales from back when you found that. And I happen to know you have a piece of paper there with some of the numbers.
Actually, I have a document I found recently. This is the Atari Corp cartridge sales since 1980 for the Atari 2600 on a run date of 7/10/84. And it lists 94 cartridges and total net for which one sold how much. And it actually shows that ET was a very successful product commercially, which sold, the number 8 best-selling product at that time, sold 1.7 million units.
Can you repeat that number, please?
Here's one of them.
Yes, I could.
Howard, you should be up here.
1,718,575. What made Atari a viable business was a revolutionary notion that Nolan Bushnell had, which that he cranked the markup on the product way beyond normal for media products. Normally, this was all new stuff. These were new industries, new technologies, and actually new businesses. So if you go in and buy a paperback book, which I bought quite a few paperback books for 35 cents. Of course, a pack of cigarettes cost 50. Though now actually books cost 10 and cigarettes only cost 5, so something's happening there. Taxes, I guess. No, books are really expensive by comparison.
Stick to the point.
So the point is there was a normal markup. You'd go, if it costs me XYZ to print this book, I will sell it for XYZ plus some markup. Nolan cranked his markup up by like 5x. He said, if I have a $5, if it costs me $5 to make a ROM, I will wholesale it for 20. He cranked his margin on Atari 2600 carts up really high. There's a lot of money made by that. And no one knew. If you were a buyer for a department store, you had no idea how much Nolan was paying for his cartridge, so you couldn't complain. You thought it cost him a lot, you were willing to pay a lot for it, because people were willing to pay quite a bit for it, because they were a lot of fun. It was a new kind of fun that no one had ever really seen before in their living room.
Now,
These were the early days.
now contrast that profit margin that he's talking about with today.
Which I didn't see much of.
How many people in this room have bought a game on the iPhone for 99 cents and complained that it wasn't worth the money? Where's that margin in that 99 cents? That's a whole different story.
In all fairness, volumes are very different.
Let's start at state of the past. There we go.
Stay in the past.
I have a question. You guys are all software developers, cowboy days, old video games. I wonder if you have any horror stories about lost software or, oh, the tape, I left it in the back of my car.
I got a good one.
Or somebody shipped a ROM and it got burned wrong.
There
or
was
something.
the day I came to work on a Monday. I worked all weekend, and I found out we had a common central computer that we kept our source on, and I found that all my work had disappeared. And so I went to Mark Davis, the guy who was our IT guy, and I said, Mark, what the hell's going on? My stuff is gone. He said, oh, no problem. We'll just restore it from the Sunday night back up, and you'll be right back where you were Sunday afternoon. And I said, fine, just put that back up. I'll be ready to work in an hour. So I went out, did something, came back, and Mark said, I'm sorry, we've got a problem. We didn't do the Sunday backup. We did a Friday night backup, though, at 8 p.m., our usual weekly backup, and so, you may have lost your weekend's work. Well, I'm unhappy camper now, but, 2 days' work, especially when it's fresh in your mind, sometimes you can redo it better than I went in the first time, right? So I'm okay with this, I can live with this, and I'm all right, just restore the machine to Friday state, and I'll be getting on my way. Oh, an hour later, I come back, Mark, the machine hasn't been restored yet, what the hell's going on? Well, turns out the guy I hired to do the backups 2 months ago has never, ever done a backup. Yeah. Well, fortunately for me, I did my own backup, so I don't like last till Friday afternoon sometime when I did my own personal backup. So there's a lesson for you kids, do your own backups, don't trust AT group. But the punchline of this joke is, when I heard this, I was so angry. I was standing in a lab, these big lab stools to sit at the lab bench, and I picked one up and I threw it clean across the lab, 20 feet, and into the wall where it made a permanent enduring mark to remind everyone how angry I was that day. And the next time that he hired a new IT guy to replace the first one, which was Jack Dool, by the way, if anyone remembers Jack. When Jack Dool came on board, Mark brought him a mouse and said, and be careful of this guy, he throws chairs.
Yeah, but also in fairness, to contextualize this, the technology, it was technology. And technology, is a harsh mistress. Great novel by Robert Hyland. So there was really an interesting juxtaposition of two really diametrically opposed dynamics of the video games industry. Right? We didn't have a problem with ROM masks, because actually we were a semiconductor manufacturing company. Right? And there was a lot of no fooling around engineers somewhere out in hardware. And 2600 is a really brutal environment to develop in, right? You had to be extremely precise, right? So these cowboys were actually not cowboys. We're like rocket scientists, right? I mean, really, it was really tough. But at the same time, in the IP space, in the content, it was really, really a lot of fun. Right, so there's really two things going on, and Howard, spoke to this earlier in his presentation. There's two things going on here, right? This is technology, right, and it's software pretty much garbage in, garbage out, or good stuff in, good stuff out, which is what we had to do. The 2600 cuts you zero slack. But in terms of making the game fun, this was a brand new culture, something that had never really existed yet.
Yeah, I guess they're still looking for fun stories about crashed video games.
You know, the only thing I have on that is I had a Atari 2600 Ball Blazers that I was very proud of, which got to a very good proof of concept, technology proof of concept point. And when I left Atari, I did take a couple of EEPROMs, but I didn't put masking tape over the clear window.
No!
So when I went back to try them 2 years later, they were gone, and honest to God, that source code is just lost, and I miss it. I wish I had that source code.
That actually reminds me, we went through a lot of EEPROMs at Atari. And what we would do, actually in the early days, is we'd take them on, put them on baking trays and set them on the roof in order to zero them.
That's what we do. I actually remember a couple stories where there was a time when we were using a PDP-11 desktop computer that used an 8-inch floppy, and that was our development. And one guy liked to store his floppies on top of the television set. Which is one of the highest magnetism devices in the room that you can put it on, and lost a lot of data. And I remember somebody else, I think, Todd, you and I overlapped at Atari by just a couple months.
Nope.
No?
You were gone the Friday that I started, the Monday after you
I'm
left.
trying to remember who it was then. It was somebody that I had overlapped by just a little bit.
That could be
And
Rob.
they
Rob was
they
there
were
for
still
like 4 months
using,
while you weren't.
still using the 8-inch floppy for this development. And I would watch him walk around the halls carrying his floppy around his finger, twirling it.
That wasn't
Now,
Rob.
the directory tracks are right there on the inside getting, fingerprint goo on them when you're doing that. And I thought that was fun.
We had the Kromenko S100 boat anchors.
Yeah.
The
But,
development system-
it's funny, the throwing of a chair is a different response. We've all had, anybody who's worked with computers has had data crash, and even if you do backups every hour, whereas these days, Apple is so good at that time machine, but forgetting that, we've all had crashes, sometimes hours, sometimes days of data, and the last time it happened to me, I remember I'm typing along, and something had gone wrong, and the, thing starts spinning, and basically the computer has died, and I've lost everything since I last saved. And I just said, crap, and started over. It's like, it's happened so many times, why get mad anymore? It's just, you just know it's a part of the job, and you just move right on. And I remember thinking that, I said, I probably should have gotten mad, but I just started over.
There was no one to get mad at.
That's
But I'm going to reiterate my point. The fact of the matter is, yes, there's a lot of weird cowboy stuff going on, but we're actually very serious engineers and technologists. But the cowboy stuff was all in the ideas and all in what we were doing, not how we were doing it.
You had a question?
I do have a question. There seems to be some mystery surrounding the prizes from the Sword Quest tournament and Atari dissolved. And I'm just curious whether the prizes were actually melted down or whether we're going to find one on eBay one of these days.
That's not in our domain.
The only person here who could speak to that might be Rob, because the prizes that remained, the Tremels took possession of.
There's nothing like that.
Okay, so
They took it back in
you're
84.
going to have to look in the Bermuda Triangle for the answer to that.
Yeah, it's not in our realm.
As far as I know, the hard factor are in Ready Player One. The one kid that wasn't awarded the prize, I believe he melted it down.
Couple people won a lot. Okay, so I was
Some of the prizes were never actually made.
The Sword Quest series was my baby. I was the visionary behind it. I designed the storyline, the concept of having the comic book go along with it and having the prizes go with it. Because as Franklin Mint was owned by Warner, DC Comics was owned by Warner. It was my most ambitious endeavor and the last serious effort to make a product that I undertook. It was pretty much a flop.
You notice it's also an effort by Atari to develop their own IP, and they gave them a lot of leeway there.
They gave me a lot of leeway. Like I said, And actually, it's interesting because it cost them more. But it was interesting because I pulled in a lot of parts of Warner. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have tried to make a movie too. Then people would have totally gone. But a couple of the prizes were won. I believe that one of the winners has his prize still, and another one of them sold it. And I don't know what happened to the sold one. They were spec'd out as being XYZ dollars worth, $25,000 in meltdown value. So when you got the Sword Quest prize for $25,000, it had $25,000 worth of gold, platinum, silver, and semi-precious and precious stones on it. They put $25,000 worth of materials into the prize, which was worth
paying the programmers
$25,000. By then they were paying us a little more because Rob and I gained the benefit of those who left for Activision, which got management's attention a little bit. But then when the next bunch of people left to form Imagic, then they went, oh my God. You know,
led by their own marketing.
That's why they got a little more attention. It was their own marketing guy who defected and took them.
Even Ray Kassar had to notice that. Go, I've got another question on you. So, okay, the guy on the far right there, you're anxious. Yeah.
Yeah, have you ever thrown something in your code that's like a placeholder or just a test purpose and it ended up being like a fundamental part of the game that you ended up loving?
That happens sometimes. There's a lot of shit that happens. It's not necessarily put in there deliberately. It's like, consider Rob Fulop's game, Demon Attack, right? Demon Attack basically arises from a bug in the 2600 hardware. And Rob said, oh, look at this doesn't work right. That might make an interesting game.
Rob and I, who shared an office for 5 years at Atari, had a moment where I think he was working with a variation on the Space Invaders kernel. We were reverse engineering that to put in a Muppets title. And the way that kernel wrote is the way that it moved down the screen. We didn't realize this. We had a bunch of graphics on the bottom half of the screen, and as the Space Invaders came down, we didn't expect this. It started to push the second half of the screen down, so Miss Piggy disappeared off the bottom of the screen. And I think that made it into a product that never shipped.
Muppets in Spaceship, yes. Bill asked for money, and I forget the other gentleman did the third game.
But that was an accident of source code that actually was pretty darn cool.
There actually is one example in a Boy and His Blob, if you know Boy and His Blob from NES. Dave's game, which I helped him with, and in the caverns, you would come into a screen where there was a worm that jumped back and forth in an arc made up of many pieces. Well, I wrote that code, and it was a bug, because it was supposed to be one little round object bouncing, but I had a bug in the seed algorithm that put it out. So when it put out, instead of putting out one when you came on screen, it put out about 50. And all of a sudden, all of these little round objects are bouncing back and forth. And I looked at it and I said, God, it's really cool. It looks like some sort of a creature. And I said, Dave, take a look at this. We're going to leave this in. So once in a while it happens, you get lucky.
Well, and it became a category of centipede objects, centipede characters, where you leave a copy of it behind, you know, and have 8 segments or whatever and move it around.
Yeah. Another time I was working on an air hockey game, an online game. It ended up actually going on the iPhone. And I was programming in it, and it was just so weird. This happened, I've written millions of lines of code, and it's so strange. Once in a long while, I had to write the routine for the computer-controlled object that controls the air hockey paddle on the other side of the table you're playing against. And you know, the way I write something like that is I start and I write maybe just a framework of 15 or 20 lines of code, and then I say, all right, I'm going to build off this framework and make it more intelligent, make it smart, make it able to do this or do that. So I throw in 15 or 20 lines of code, I assemble it, I run it, and this thing is unbelievable. I mean, it's carrying the puck with it as it moves left and right, and then it shoots, and I shoot back, and it's backing up, and I'm like, what the hell is it doing? And I don't even know what the code was doing, but it was doing it so well I left it in. And I never touched that routine again. It's this amazing, amazing piece of AI. And for the life of me, I don't understand what I did. It worked really good. Doesn't happen very often, but that
But
time
an
it did.
interesting sidelight to this question, if you do go back to the 2600, I mean, we've developed on 25 different consoles over the years. The 2600 games typically are rewritten 60, 70 times before you're done. I mean, you'll start with the code, you get everything working, and let's say it was a 2K target, you're sitting there with 3K of code. And you've got to figure out a way to do the exact same things that you just did in 3K and do it in 2K. So I mean, imagine taking out 1 in every 3 instructions and still having the code work. So every single routine gets rewritten. You start over and you say, okay, here it is on the side. I'm going to try to write that same thing and figure out tricks, techniques. There are all sorts of fun tricks for eliminating just 1 or 2 bytes. Bob Whitehead did one of my favorites where he had a graphic table, and the first byte of the graphic table was hex 60, which also happens to be the opcode for RTS, return from subroutine.
All good Stella programmers know the opcode set by number.
That's true, right. So,
Most of us have forgotten it.
so basically, he took his, one of the subroutines, he embedded the table after the subroutine and commented out the RTS command and let it fall through to the table to use the 60 that's there. Little things like that, you could get 1 or 2, but so often you had to completely rewrite large sections of the code. And you'd kind of like start from scratch and rewrite it and look, all right, I saved 5 bytes, but you really needed to save 300, right? So the question was specifically, did you ever put anything in as a placeholder that ended up staying there? And the answer is unequivocally no in the 2600, because by the time you have touched every single line of code 15, 20 times, and the whole thing, like I said, 50 or 60 times of rewrites, there's nothing superfluous in there at all.
Right, and the opposite of that story is I remember a programmer at Activision later in our time at Activision, when there were a lot more programmers writing a lot more games, and inevitably that diluted the quality of the games. I mean, let's admit it, there were games that went out later that weren't as good. I remember one programmer in particular who I won't name, and somebody, and this was a rumor, I don't know if it's true or not, but somebody asked him, how did you get that, down to fit to the ROM? And he said, well, he said, cutting bytes is hard, and we all know that's, optimization's really hard. He said, what I do is I go into my code and I find a routine, I'm not sure what it does, I take it out, and then if the game still works,
Okay, so
2600 outlaw.
someone should ask me about how Pac-Man and E.T.
Before we get off on that topic, which is interesting, I want to talk about the subject of squeezing here, which is what
Yes.
this process was called.
Optimizing.
That reducing a
Scrunching.
2600 part,
Scrunching.
squeezing, scrunching. It was a very strange process, and it was very hard to optimize code like this to squeeze a few cycles out, because when you wrote 2600 code, you wrote it for optimization in the first goddamn place. So it was pretty well optimized, at least you thought it was. And the weird thing about the squeezing process, which everyone at this table will testify to, is you could always squeeze 10%.
that's right.
It's amazing.
So theoretically, you could end up with a ROM
Yeah,
of 1 byte.
that was-
You just kept going.
Once you got down to 4K or 2K, whatever you had to get to, then you'd stop. But you could always, I need 20 more bytes.
Except then a week before code release, you have a new feature you have to put in. So now you got to do it again, and it's amazing. Every time you go through the
It
code.
was a
you can
lot
figure
of
out-
that process.
On
Had you
screen.
done that for a month, you couldn't.
Well,
I mean, actually, Rob, I did not realize you were wasting ROM like that. I didn't have that luxury.
well, when we did 2600 cards, it was 2 months for a decent kernel, 2 months for gameplay, 2 months to scrunch bytes.
Yeah.
It was that intense.
I remember, we used to have, honest to God, line printer paper, right, for printouts. I remember one day a guy says to me, look at this is really good. You can't find a single wasted byte on this page of code. And I just pointed my finger at it and said, you have a clear carry instruction right here, and 20 lines above it is a branch of carry set. So you don't have to clear the carry.
You know it's clear.
You know it's already clear.
Now, you understand that when you make assumptions like that, and falling through into a table to get a 60 for an RTS, that's a bug waiting to happen. And you used to have some nasty bugs because you make that assumption, and 6 months later, well, not in our bits. 3 months later, you make a change and oops.
So what you have to do then is not remove the clear carry instruction. You have to comment it out and says, on this date, this instruction was redundant.
Right.
It could save a byte.
Right.
But it's only redundant because of the branch carry set 20 lines above.
Except there are places in routines where the accumulator stays at 0 for 40 or 50 lines, and you take advantage of that fact.
Yes.
Right.
And you don't comment that, you knew while you were writing that it was still sitting there at 0.
And then wondered why when it broke.
Well, and one example in, I think it was Outlaw, yeah. Outlaw, I had the things in the middle, you could shoot them away, there were the little bitmaps, you could shoot away the cactus and that sort of thing. And I had to scrunch the code, and I went through, and I started looking at that routine, and like in Gary's experience, I looked at it and I said, this routine could never work, as written. I don't understand what I was doing when I wrote this 3 weeks ago. And I started completely from scratch and wrote one that I knew would work. But it was sort of working, but I guess, it's like I must have started working on it because wrong bits were getting cleared or something like that. And you go back and you say, what were you thinking when you wrote this?
And this is all without mentioning 128 bytes of RAM.
I only used 40 or 50 bytes of RAM. The rest I didn't need.
I'm curious, you guys have been talking a little bit about, obviously, trying to scrunch, you're going to run into some bugs that you maybe was the process every time that you would have to burn a new ROM and look and go, oh.
No, we had dev systems.
So
As quick as doing an assemble.
We had this thing, I called it Chromenko S100 Bud Anchor. It was a card that plugged, you downloaded emulated ROMs to it.
Did it have like remote debugging, like line
Yes.
step by step?
A little bit, very little actually.
Very little.
We had HP 1611A logic analyzers. Which did great instruction and disassembly, and you could set breakpoints and watch what was going on. But there was no
poor
debugger
benighted
in the way
children
you think.
who've never used
You know, my
HP
browser has a
1611.
better debugger than we have for the 2600.
No,
We had a line
you never
editor.
have a better debugger than a goddamn logic analyzer. You kids have never, any programmers out there, you've never ever had the pleasure of working with a tool like a logic analyzer. Imagine having a memory.
1611A we all love.
You could actually program and say, Jesus, this area of memory is getting written and I don't know why. So I'll tell you what, anytime a write happens to this area of memory, you trigger on it, and I'd like to see the previous 64,000 instructions.
Yeah.
But yeah, the development systems, for example, at Activision, we built some pretty good ones. It was a blue box, it was 6502 based, it had an umbilical that came up and plugged into the Atari 2600 to turn the 2600 really into a peripheral of this device. And you could download it into memory, the thing held 16K of memory for a 4K game development, so you could go way over if you really wanted to. The monitor code that was running had the ability to replace any opcode with the break instruction and cause a break to go into the monitor code and single step, break. The 1611A was not necessary then for most development, but it was those times where somebody with an indirect pointer is writing to a piece of RAM that it's not supposed to be writing to. And the 1611A looked at all address buses and all the data buses and the read-write and phase 2 lines, and you could actually say, show me who's writing to this address.
Well, 1611 would debug in real time. Okay, so you can actually, remember, a 2600 is a machine that if you stop it, you get what you call mattress ticking on the screen, right?
Yeah.
So
The display goes away if you stop.
Single-step debugging is not always the answer for 2600 work. And Bob just did a cart here last year, and I had to go all the way up to his damn relative's place so he could time it with an oscilloscope. But,
I didn't have a 1611A.
So you did the 2600 card?
Yes.
Last year?
It's actually going to be sold at the Video Game History Museum in their gift shop.
I did not know that.
Dave knows something about this.
Wow.
And in addition to that, you just learn to make fewer bugs.
It made you really careful, yes.
I started out on punch cards in the environment that Dave was talking about, where you give the cards, I gave my cards to the teacher, put them in a box, and the next day I got the printouts, right? So you wouldn't even know if you had a typo 24 hours later. It's not like, it was different.
Yeah, that's interactive programming. Huh?
No, it was almost that bad. Day one of Activision, at Atari, before we left, we were using PDP 11 somethings that were timeshare, okay? And to get one of those, even though we had venture capital funding, to buy one of those was going to take 10 weeks, 12 weeks delivery or something like that. And we went over to the local Hamilton Avnet, which was a place that sold chips and things, and they had sitting on their floor a PDP 11 T03, which was 3 years old, model. We bought it right on the spot and bought a 6502 assembler you needed to do for making these games to assembly language. That 6502 assembler was written in Fortran and run on this PDP 11 that was so ancient that it was swapping in and out enough memory just to run the thing.
And time sharing it across like
And,
6 days.
no. Our time sharing was a switch box.
Oh, good.
So basically, you would switch yours to A, B, and he gets to talk to it.
Oh, good.
Okay? One person could talk to it at a time. So one person could be editing their code or assembling on either the line editor that we were using, or the character editor, or the assembler. And it was so slow that a 2K game took 35 minutes to compile.
Oh my God. Assembly.
Assembly language, 2K of assembly language took 35 minutes to compile. And so the small office, Activision's first office, was 800 square feet, a 20 by 20 room here, a hallway, and a 20 by 20 room here. There was the lab and the kitchen, and the rest of this was the business. And if anybody in the business side saw a programmer walking around, they'd say, "Are you compiling?" Yeah, assembling, yeah. Because nobody could do anything. So you would print out your code, the whole thing, and doodle on it for hours at a time until you could get the computer and do this. And we made 4 games from October 15th until CES, like January 6th of the following year. We made Dragster, Fishing Derby, Laser Blast, or Dragster, Checkers, Boxing, Checkers, and Fishing Derby. I did 2 games in that period of time, waiting 35 minutes for each assembly.
It's fun.
And I love those days.
To write bugs.
Question? Right here? Yeah.
What's the weirdest games you have worked on?
Oh, that's a great question.
B2600?
Or can it be any game?
Any game.
Dave, have you ever worked on a really strange game? Dave has a great story.
Gary and I started a company called Skyworks in 1995. And what we did, we pioneered what they came to call advergaming, because we had the advertisers paid us to develop the games and the users got to play them for free. Well, through a partnership that we developed. And they weren't obtrusive advertising or anything. It was really a good deal. We just put them on their website, and that drew people into their website, and they got to tell them whatever they wanted to tell them on their website.
Just to interject, if you ever played games on a site called Candy Stand, CANDYSTAND, candystand.com, those were all of our games. Dave and I built that site and made most of the games on there.
And that's what we generally did, but there were times we were not necessarily busy doing that kind of thing, and Gary would take just about anything, contract work.
Anything that brought payroll money.
Brought the payroll and helped pay the bills. So one day this company comes in, a pharmaceutical company called, I don't know, what was the company name?
I think it was GlaxoSmithKline, and sometimes they want a game. They want a game that is going to go into a trade show where it's at a booth and doctors come over and play it and learn about this. Everybody uses games for stuff like that. And if they had enough money, they would get our expertise.
So they paid us to make a game that would go on a trade show kiosk that people could play. And if you won the game, you'd enter into a database and get prizes or something like that. And so they had this new product they wanted to promote. The product was called Zelnorm. Okay? And Gary took the job, I think, before asking what Zelnorm was. But Zelnorm was an anti-diarrhea and we had to design a game for it.
Well, and in fact, I think we were working with an ad agency, and many times in those cases, like the ad agency, it's the old story, like Howard was saying, everybody thinks they can make a game. Well, the ad agency used to always think they could make a game. So they came to us with a game concept. A lot of what we had to do was based on what they told us they wanted. And then the world-renowned game designer David Crane had to build it.
So yeah, Zelnorm, I mean, we did 3 different mini games. Was it anti-diarrhea or anti-constipation?
There's a slight difference there.
Because
Someone missed the boat here in time.
game number 1, mini game number 1, I did an asteroids game with brown globular asteroids that you would shoot apart for regularity. This is true, you know.
All right, we need another question.
Well, I'm vague on the details of the game because I've tried to put it out of my mind, but similar to your question, I was on the phone with Gary once, and he was in the East Coast, I was on the West Coast. We did a number of companies that way, separated like that, and finally, I just asked him if this is really what my game design career has come to.
And we never publicized Zelnorm. It's not on Dave's CV, if you think about it.
However, I do have a working copy of it.
And you can look up Zelnorm online. You won't find the game, but you will verify the drug.
Is that weird enough for you?
Some questions about the old days. Richard there.
I'm just curious for the Activision and Magic guys. Do you have any good stories about Atari, like trying to bury you guys or trying to put you out of business when you first started?
Yes, we have a lot. You guys go first.
Well, the first trade show that Activision showed at CES was January of, what's that, 80. And we were in the 3rd lower basement of McCormick Place, you know, the cheapest booth, because we had just gotten our funding and we could buy the booth. It was too late to get it. It actually worked out pretty well because it was in the far corner, so you could see it down the 2 aisles all the way down in the corner. So we angled our sign that worked nicely. But Atari took a full-page ad in the CEO's Trade Show Daily that said something like, at Atari, we believe that anyone who steals trade secrets from a company and starts another company is evil and is breaking the law. And they went on in a full-page ad. And our CEO, Jim Levy, found it first, and he brought it over to us, and he said, you know what? I agree with everything they said, because we didn't do any of those bad things, but they were just basically trying to color us as evil and terrible, and, you know, the day we opened our doors, basically.
Oh yeah, we were, the day we opened our doors, we were in court, and it was by Atari. Of course, it was tossed out of court immediately, and because we had, we actually had a chip peeler, so we had valid, reverse engineering documentation, and
yeah,
the Atari salesman would say, you can't plug in a Magic cartridge into an Atari machine, you're going to break it.
It'll break it. Oh, they told everything.
And I bet they did that for
yeah.
Activision cartridges too.
But I was the one deposed in the lawsuit.
Just on that side, the reason they used that tack is because they'd actually patented the plastic shape for their case.
The little wedge that parted the doors was patented.
So that particular shape of the case.
Yeah, we had to design a cartridge that would work, that would mate with the part in the game without using their design patent, and that they couldn't go and change their mold and make our cartridges not work. So if you look at the Atari 26 cartridge, you've got these 2 mating things that open, okay? And you really only need 2 points to open the bottom one and slide the cartridge in. But we realized at the time that they could have blocked something behind their cartridge 1/4 inch down and stopped our cartridges from going if we only used these points. So you'll see in the first 3 or 4 years of Activision cartridges, the points that open the thing are spring-loaded. Actually, a lot of extra cost. There are these little things with the springs and the slides and all this, and they were made spring-loaded, not because they had to be, but so that Atari couldn't redesign their system and put it out that made Activision games not work.
We're almost out of time. One more question?
Come up the far back there.
I was just wondering how much, you said you guys go to arcades a lot, how much getting the feel of being in an arcade influenced like the Pac-Man and the Donkey Kong games that you guys worked on?
Well, when I did Donkey Kong, I had a coin-op game sitting in my office. So, and I loved the Donkey Kong game before I got the project. So I was thrilled when I got the project because I loved the game. I mean, it was a fabulous game. So it certainly helped to play it, to understand the feel, but it was completely useless in terms of art and code because you couldn't use any of it.
And remember, in the early days of the 2600 group, coin-op was right downstairs. And our assembly times weren't quite as bad as what Dave and Gary are describing. But there were always breaks while we were compiling or printing listings. So Todd's an amazing Asteroids and Defenders player.
As far as, I spent a lot of time in arcades before I got the job at Atari. Once I started working there, I didn't spend much time out of the office. In the second year I was there, they started bringing coin-op games that we hadn't made at Atari. They started bringing them in the office, so we had our own competitive research lab. And I spent a lot of time playing. I love Defenders and Robotron. I mean, Eugene Jarvis, what can you say? And I played, we had Pac-Man, and so we didn't really get out in public very much once you got
You're very pale.
at Atari.
Right, but we were...
Long hair, long fingernails.
It took a lot of dedication. You did not have much spare time or social life.
But the point that's missing here is we were all gamers before we started making games. And the synergy in the development group is what made most of these games really cool. I mean, if you take, you know, in Activision we had 4 people working, we worked in a bullpen on purpose, so that we were all kind of, we had kind of an unwritten code. If you were like this, nobody would talk to you. If you were like this, people would come over and kibitz. You're playing your game up on the TV up here. And you get tremendous advice from other people. And so you're looking at 30, 40 years of combined gamer experience, all going into each game. So there was a lot of the feel of the arcade because, like I said, we were all gamers in the first place. But it's really important to remember that synergy, the way we would all work together, help each other, make suggestions. We weren't very kind about it sometimes. You know, you'd walk by and say, "That looks like crap." But and the rule was, it was one man, one game. So if somebody told me that my game looked like crap, it was up to me if I wanted to make a change. But you did tend to, you respected the opinion of your peers, and you did tend to, you know, work on that kind of stuff.
And that is a good point. We were all gamers. I don't trust anybody who says they design games, but they don't play them. I mean, I don't buy that.
You know, in fairness, I mean, this was, again, there's a history to this. These were very early days in a very early culture. And honestly, I don't know that the guys that, I'm not saying this to be divisive, but just factually, 2600 was made so that you could take some relatively simple Atari coin-op games into the living room. Over the years, though, I mean, really, Space Invaders was the first huge game done by someone else entirely that was licensed and a big hit. Space Invaders sold, it's number 2, sold total net of 6,078,000 units. Pac-Man sold a total of 7,982,000.
Did a great job.
And so these guys at Activision, there was a transition that occurred at Atari only, which is where we were much, much more driven by possible licensed IP. So we had all of the hit coin-op games there, even if they weren't done by Atari, so that someone could go out and buy the license. And it's a huge transition that occurred that Howard and I, more than almost anyone else, got caught in, where we licensed Pac-Man and we licensed E.T., and it changed from making the best game you could to making the best game you could that could almost be called something else.
You gotta understand it. You asked, I didn't quite get the gist of the question, but, you know, were we heavily influenced by, well, hell yeah, we were all gamers,
Yeah.
but you can't take Defender and port it to the 2600, you know? You're gonna have to change the damn game. And the people have gotten so close with that hardware to games that you recognize in the arcade, like Brad Stewart's brilliant Asteroids. You know, I mean, that's a tribute to their fantastic skill, not to that hardware. The hardware was meant to do combat, that was it.
Breakout, Space Invaders. Space Invaders is probably the most difficult, closest that could be done, actually. Richard Maurer, Space Invaders, great card, brilliant technology.
I think we're out of time.
We're way over time.
Does anyone have any minutes of gold?